With a focus on advancing emergency care, Zoll delivers innovative, user-friendly technology designed for where and how you work, and for the patients who rely on the care you provide. Zoll is committed to helping you save more lives.
Thank you very much. That was very kind. So I'm going to race through some general concepts about the evidence evaluation process, and the specific title is Putting It Together. So I'm from Australia, as you can see down the bottom, where convicts, giant spiders and deranged gunmen come from. There are lots of other very interesting things that go on in Australia, as you can see from that slide. We have pretty exciting nightlife. There's a bit of a drug culture, so yeah. But we also love our football. And football in Australia is a bit different to football in a lot of other places. Anyway, clearly I've got some conflicts of interest. The main conflict of interest that I have, I guess, is the intellectual one, and that is I'm not only chair of the Resuscitation Council but a member of ILCOR, and obviously been part of the evidence evaluation process for a long period of time. So I believe the process is actually pretty good. That doesn't mean that we can't improve it. So this is what I'm going to cover in this brief period of time. Why review the evidence at all? What are the key components of a good review of the evidence? How do you become a good evidence reviewer? And what does a good review actually look like? And I'll go through each of those components. So we review the evidence for two main reasons. The first one is you can't really produce guidelines unless you have evidence there to support that. We obviously like to encourage people to do systematic reviews at the same time because they can be independently publishable. And that's a bit of a carrot that we can use to encourage people to be involved with the process. It does require a lot of work, though. You need to actually get out and look at the individual articles. It's quite a complicated process, as you see. We got a lot of people involved from a lot of different countries, spending thousands of hours to answer a lot of questions, and they evaluated in the order of about 150,000 medical and scientific articles. 150,000. So I don't know about you, but it's pretty tough to read 150. Even on my iPad, it would take a long time. And some of that data is quite conflicting, and sometimes there is just not much there. So what are the key components of a good review? The key components really are a few, and let's start with the attention to detail. And I'm sure that you're all well aware of that sort of thing. And this is a summary, sort of dot point summary of the process that we use. And I'll make sure that the slides are available to anyone that wants them. So they'll either get in touch with me or Swehan. Now, I'll go through some components of this a little bit later on, but this is a sort of a sequential flow of what we need to do. And some of this relates specifically to a new process we embarked on with the 2015 guidelines, and that is the GRADE process. And you're going to say, what's GRADE? Well, GRADE is a 5-letter acronym, grading of recommendations, assessment, development and evaluation. But it's a group of international epidemiologists and critical appraisal experts who got together to try and come up with a better process, which is more transparent, more structured, and allows people to come up with guidelines and people can see how they got to that point. Now, GRADE has been taken up by a number of organisations internationally, including some of the key ones which you can see there, Cochrane, BMJ Clinical Evidence, Up to Date, etc. But now ILCOR. So the older systems looked at a study. I found a great study, and you read the study. What GRADE tends to do is it's what they call outcome-centric. It looks across the studies for the outcome results. It starts off in the... I'm not allowed to use pointer, apparently, Gavin says, but I'm going to do it anyway. It starts up here, and you choose your outcomes. It goes across the studies, and then you decide on the evidence that supports each of those outcomes. You assess the bias of that, rate the quality of evidence, and then get a group of people together to come up with the final recommendations. So, all right, that's a sort of summary walkthrough of the process. And GRADE's quality of evidence is really a reflection of how confident we are that the result is accurate. And we have 4 categories that they use: high, moderate, low and very low. And I'll come back to the specific definitions. But in general, high means we're very confident that the effect is correct. Moderate, moderately confident. Low, low confidence if you like. And very low, very little confidence at all. So there are good and bad things about the GRADE process. It allows us to start with a high level of evidence for randomised controlled trials. Observational studies start at low level. And Unfortunately, if there are methodological limitations or inconsistency, indirectness and imprecision or publication bias, you lower the quality of evidence. And I'll go through this again later on. And 3 factors can raise the quality of evidence: addressing confounding, large effect size, and dose response. Now, one of the good things about GRADE, it's quite explicit about saying a randomised controlled trial isn't just the same as a randomised controlled trial, and maybe a good non-randomised trial is just as good evidence to support what you want to do. But once you start to go down this track and challenge randomised controlled trials, it's a little bit sort of scary. But you think about it. Let's just go through some of these. Insulin, blood transfusion, anaesthesia, no randomised controlled trials. So a lot of the stuff that we do is actually based on good non-randomised controlled trials. 2 examples, penicillin and parachutes. Pretty dramatic effects. So yes, in the BMJ there was published a systematic review of all the randomised controlled trials related to parachutes, and you know the end result of that. There were no systematic... Right. So, but if you look at the observational data, where you have 821 injuries and 18 deaths out of 2.2 million jumps, as opposed to what happens if a plane explodes and people just go flying to the ground without parachutes. All right? There's a substantial risk reduction by putting a parachute on. So we would consider that quite a dramatic effect. What about polio epidemic in the 50s? So they introduced a tracheostomy and a bit of bag ventilation. And in that hands, it halved the mortality. You're going to then embark on a randomised controlled trial? That's a tough one. Closed chest cardiac massage, when that was introduced, we had a 70% survival rate. And prior to that, no one survived a cardiac arrest, especially not in the wards, unless they had open cardiac massage. Wow, randomised control trial. So, and the other trouble with big randomised control trials, of course, they just support your own paradigm. So we did the SAFE study, which had 7,000 patients in it, comparing albumin with normal saline. And there was no difference between the two. So if I use albumin all the time, I go, oh, look, I can use albumin. And if I don't want to use albumin, I say, oh, look, there's no reason to use albumin. So sometimes the specific and limited questions that are asked actually mean that we can't interpret the studies very well. So you have to be aware of the 2 sides to that process. Clearly we need more research. Clearly we need more research. But research is expensive. It costs, this is a guesstimate of $40,000 per patient in some of the more sophisticated trials. So that's a lot of money. And this is just one simple example from the cardiac arrest literature. Amiodarone in ventricular fibrillation. The problem with coming up with a really good, tight, methodologically intact study, the eligible people that weren't actually enrolled had the same survival as the amiodarone group because the control group actually got intravenous detergent. So they couldn't tell the difference between amiodarone and the placebo. So you need to follow instructions. Right, smart people, I accept that. But you still need fairly explicit instructions. And I don't know what that means. All right, so let's look at the search articles that are identified. We expect the reviewers to go through the titles and the abstracts and exclude many, many studies out of thousands to end up with those that are required to be reviewed by full text review. And then we want them to look at the references and look at whether or not of those are appropriate, and we want them to forward search on the key references to see if they've been cited by any subsequent publications. A very powerful way of adding to the original search, but it takes work. And then we want them to talk about the bias of the individual studies. And the bias, as I said before, is the certainty we have around the reported results. We use the Cochrane standard grade approach for bias assessment for randomised controlled trials, and I'll sort of summarise it. This is a table. So the first bit is, was it truly random? Was the allocation concealed? So I didn't know what the next person was going to get. Was the patient and treatment team blinded to the intervention? Were the outcome assessors blinded to that intervention? Did people follow them up completely to the end? Were the correct outcomes actually selected and reported on, not someone that they thought was a good idea or it became positive? And are there any other significant biases? All right, so fairly standard approach to randomized controlled trials. And we get them to tabulate that. And this is an example. Here you've got low risk of bias, and that's green, sort of like stoplights, and red, high risk of bias. And you can tell just by looking at it, and yellow is in between. You can tell by looking at this that there are some areas of high risk of bias. And this is all about a table of individual studies, predominantly for the critical outcomes. Okay, for non-randomised controlled trials, we used a fairly straightforward process, which was used in grade, looking again for bias. So we go, were the entry criteria for the same for the two groups? Were the confounding variables controlled for? Were all the things that should have impacted on outcome, were they controlled for? Were the outcome assessments the same in both groups? And was there complete follow-up? Very straightforward questions. And again, we did the same sort of thing. So for a particular study, we assessed whether it was high, unclear or low. And then what we did is we took all that information for each outcome and put it into a table. So we want you to complete an evidence profile table, which is combining all the evidence about that outcome across all the studies into one line. It's a summary. So what does it look like? Well, it's got all these characteristics, and I'll go through them briefly one by one. So we start off with how many studies were there, what type of studies were there, what was the overall risk of bias. Remember our green-red table? We decide on the basis of that whether or not there's an overall risk of bias which is not serious, serious or very serious. And so if it's mainly green, we say it's not serious. If there's a mixture, it's probably serious. And if it's really predominantly red, we say it's very serious. What about inconsistency between the studies? So 2 studies showed improved survival and 1 study says it makes survival worse. That's inconsistency, and we downgrade it for that. Indirectness is looking at studies that either have a different population group or a different intervention. We can include animal studies, but they are very indirect, so they get downgraded from that point of view. But it's still included in all that evidence. What about imprecision? So if they're broad confidence intervals and we can't be certain that that effect is actually true, then we downgrade the overall evidence for imprecision. And then we think about publication bias. And publication bias, it's either not probably detected or possibly there, and it's suspected, really. We're not forcing people to go through a sophisticated statistical analysis of that. But for example, if there are a small number of studies, especially if they're all industry-sponsored and there's significant conflict of interest, then we would say that that is a serious risk. Now, what about large effect? I mentioned that before with parachutes. So if it's twice as likely to survive or 5 times as likely to survive, we can actually potentially upgrade the evidence as long as otherwise methodologically it's pretty good. Now, what about plausible confounding? This is an example of if all the variables suggest that the outcome should be worse in a particular intervention, but the intervention actually has an improved outcome, then you might even upgrade it for that. So increased survival in asystole in cardiac arrest despite more asystole in the intervention group, for example. What about dose-response gradient? So it might be inverse or it might be direct. So maybe decreased time to defibrillation improves outcome, decreased time to bystander CPR, increased bystander CPR rate associated with improved outcomes. So they're all potential things for a dose-response gradient. We do then want the people to summarise in terms of some sort of relative risk, so either using a risk ratio or an odds ratio, and some absolute difference between the 2 intervention and control groups. Now, sometimes we allow people to combine that into a meta-analysis, but in general we suggest that they don't combine it unless methodologically it's appropriate to do so. But you see more and more of these out there. And across the board for the evidence for the outcome, remember how randomised controlled trials started with high? There may be many reasons why we want to downgrade that evidence, and it may end up as very low. And the vast majority of assessments for the evidence for our COSTAR process ended up with very low. And now you can see why that could occur. So let's talk about how the consensus on science and treatment recommendations might look, this COSTAR. It's aligned with the grade process, and it's really a statement of what the table shows. And so we might start off saying for the critical outcome of survival to hospital discharge, we've identified moderate quality evidence downgraded for indirectness from 2 randomised controlled trials showing no benefit, and there's some estimate of the relative risk and the absolute risk there. Okay? So that's the way we describe it. And the wording of the treatment recommendation then might be we recommend against or we recommend for, which is a strong recommendation, or we suggest against or suggest for, which is a weak recommendation. Occasionally we might make a strong recommendation when there's no evidence. And we do that if it's cheap, easy and harmless. They're the sort of general rules. All right, we do a lot of that. But you have to word things appropriately. And you have to target your audience. And that's why Resuscitation Council of Asia has a slightly different approach perhaps, or maybe Malaysian Resuscitation Council has a slightly different approach to what it would be in North America or in Australia. We then encourage the group to come up with what we call a values and preference statement. And this is just additional explanatory comments to help people understand what the thought processes were. And so you might say something like, in making this recommendation, we place a high value on not allocating resources to an ineffective intervention over any unproven or benefit for critical or important outcomes. Right? There's not enough evidence out there, but we think it might be worth doing. Okay, now, if you want to be a good reviewer, you have to have an open mind. I appreciate that we all come with biases. Right? We think this is an egg. The reality is it's a bit of a mess sometimes. We're looking really carefully at data and we see subtle things that worry us. And sometimes it's not quite so subtle stuff. And we might have passionately believed that something was supported by the evidence, and then we find out that it wasn't. It's a sad slide, that one, isn't it? So how do you become a good evidence reviewer? Well, the first thing is you can volunteer or you can be sort of pointed at and dragged kicking and screaming. People often sort of volunteer. Yeah, I'll do it, Peter. Great. And then you start to introduce them to the process and they're going, what on earth is going on here? There is a sort of parallel universe of evidence evaluation that we introduce people to. And it is an international process, and the people you're working with may well be on opposite sides of the world. We expect you to be a little bit pedantic about things. It's actually quite helpful. We want you to respond electronically to emails and other messages. In general, we want you to apply simple rules. They can be sort of yes-no type things, similar to the engineering slide. But eventually, we want you to be able to play to this very complicated piece of music some very nice stuff. Now, of course, if you do things that are slightly off track or things that we don't want, then we have a process of working out where you live, coming around, and encouraging you to adhere to the rules. No, not true. Now, this takes a lot of time. So there'll be times towards the end of the day where you're a bit tired. I appreciate that. You know, it's sunset and you want to just sort of relax. But we encourage you to do other things, such as work out how you're going to get through the all-nighter so you can do the teleconference at 4 o'clock in the morning. But in general, we just need you to keep calm. All right, so what does a good review look like? Well, I'm going to summarise a review that was published in Circulation, which was part of the Advanced Life Support Task Force that produced on target temperature management. So this publication, we looked at the question, and the first question I'm going to summarise, which is, in any setting, does inducing mild hypothermia with a target temperature of 32 to 34, compared with no targeted temperature management, change outcome? Okay. So cooling versus no cooling. We look at the outcomes, and we think that the critical outcomes are survival with favourable neurological function, or possibly just survival. Not as good, but still good. And then we work with the information specialist to fine-tune a search strategy, and that's what a search strategy looks like. It's quite complicated and requires a bit of input from the information specialist to help us come up with that. And then we use that to search the literature, search 3 databases, Embase, Cochrane and Medline, and then we come up with articles to review. And with this, originally 6,000 articles were identified. And then we slowly whittled it down. 11 included in the qualitative synthesis, and 2 for survival to neurological outcome, and 3 for neurological outcome. All right, so a lot of work that goes into excluding these studies. So then we agreed on the bias, so we would risk risk assess these various things according to the bias assessment tools that we showed you before. As you can remember, some of these studies are randomised or pseudo-randomised, so we're using the randomised controlled trial bias assessment tool. And then we put it into an evidence profile table, which looks something like this. And interesting, if you just look through it, we say, okay, well, there's a couple of randomised controlled trials. We're worried that there is a serious risk of bias. We're worried that imprecision is a serious risk of bias. And the overall quality of evidence, despite maybe starting in a randomised controlled trial, is then downgraded by 2 and ends up being low rather than high. And here we might have a different particular question, serious indirectness and serious imprecision, and we're now downgrading a randomised controlled trial by 3 levels and it becomes very low. So that's a very different process to what we'd used previously. For observational studies, of course, they start at low, and if they have any downgrading, then they end up at very low. Okay, so we might put a summary of that information. So here, for example, we've included a forest plot, and the forest plots are these diamonds, and they're either a little bit on one side or a little bit on the other side, and if they're significantly on one side, not overlapping this line, of course, you know that that favours a particular intervention. So that was quite helpful. We also like them to summarise it here with a relative risk, 0.75. So implying there are less people dying, and there's a way of describing it in absolute numbers. Okay, so then you come up with a consensus on science statement, and you saw before for a critical outcome, low quality evidence, downgraded, 1 randomised and 1 quasi-randomised, involving all these patients with a risk ratio, a relative risk of 1.4, so 40% more likely to survive with a good neurological outcome. And then the treatment recommendation, we recommend targeted temperature management. Now, this is despite low quality evidence, so we've cheated a little bit, haven't we? We've made that discordant recommendation because we believe strongly that we should actually do that. It's a complicated process, but the people that are involved with the process learn a lot about critical appraisal, and they contribute substantially to saving lives throughout the world. So the grade process has complicated the process a little bit more, but made it more transparent. And I think it's easier for people, once they're used to that process, to be able to see what evidence there actually is to support the guidelines that we've come up with. We've summarised it to a degree in part 2 of the Consensus on Science statement, but hopefully talking about it today has allowed you to get a bit more insight into that process. So thank you.